welcome to the lecture on the beginning of the Washington and Adams administrations, which covers the years from about 1789 with the election of George Washington as the first president, and 1800 with the transfer of power from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. And by this time, the government of the United States has split into two factions or two political parties, and the election of 1800 represents a transfer of power from one of those parties to another party, and a bit of a turning point there. So this lecture is just going to be the beginning. We're just going to sort of set things up, looking at what the United States was at 1789, 1790, and looking at some of the initial actions that Washington took, knowing that as the first, a lot of people are going to follow in his footsteps, follow his example. The idea of precedents, doing something for the first time. And he understands this very much so, that he is doing something for the first time. So United States, 1789, 1790, most are still hovered around the Atlantic seaboard. You can see the red areas are the areas of high concentration. Up in Massachusetts, our little hook there, New York and Pennsylvania, very close to the border there, and here in Chesapeake there. And this would be Charleston, maybe? Not so sure, but a little peak there. But starting to push out. They're going down the Ohio River here. They're crossing over the Appalachian Mountains, and there's definitely that frontiersman out there, and that American ideal of the frontiersman, that loner, with his family, but very much responsible for himself. So they're starting to push out there, but not really much yet. And if you look at the numbers comparison-wise of population, America really stands out as being much smaller than the big powers at the time. France, 25 million, Britain and Spain both with 10 million, with the USA just a mere 4 million. But you know what? The 19th century is going to be a time of great population growth in the United States, both natural population growth and through immigration as well. And they're going to really move up in that areas, especially as they expand. Now, one thing that was set up with the government is decided that every 10 years you'll take a census and you'll count the number of people. And so the very first sentence, 1790, we can see their population and how it all breaks down here. And you can always just pause and have a look at the numbers here. But a couple of things I'd like to point out is Virginia really leading the way. Okay, so if you over our right column here, this is our totals, and 747,000, clearly much higher than the next one, which is 434, which is Pennsylvania. They attract a lot of immigrants. And then there's sort of some 300s, New York, Massachusetts, the Carolinas are sort of in there. And here we got the slave populations. We got some that are already at none, others that are very low, like Vermont, 16 in there. If we looked at New York and slaves right at there, they're at 21,000, but that's going to start to lessen as gradual emancipation takes effect in the New York colonies there. All right, so you can always just pause and just have a look at the numbers here of where are they, how many there are, and we saw where that compares with the European powers of the time. So Washington and precedents. He's fully aware. He knows. Okay, I'm the first. Everybody else is going to sort of take my lead, and so he wants to lead by example and give the future presidents a model to build off of. And he understands that he's being watched by the whole world. This experiment, it looked like under the Articles of Confederation is going to fail, and Britain and France and Spain were all ready to pounce in. But, then they sort of sat down and they think they solved those problems with the Constitution, a new, stronger, centralized government with a president, this whole new concept of a head of state. It's very much like a king. Is it going to work? And so he really wants to set a good example. And he wants the image of the president to be one of dignity and authority. A person, an office, no matter who's in it, it commands respect. And so by the way that he dresses, the way that he speaks, the way that he acts, the way that he holds himself in public must be one of dignity, but also conveyeth strength. He's the man. He's the boss. And, he's got checks and balances and limitations, but, there's a lot of power and authority within the office, no matter who's in position. A cabinet. That's not part of the Constitution that says that the president can gather together a group of advisors, but he feels, I should not be the only one making decisions. I should bring in, wise people, maybe people of different views, and I can listen to them out and then make decisions on what I feel is the best reasonable and logical move forward. So he is going to bring in a cabinet. Well, we'll take a look at the cabinet in a moment. And transfer of power. He quit after 8 years. He did 2 terms and said, that's it. He could have served the rest of his life, but he wanted to, he wanted to show that the president should be not staying for president forever. So he let somebody else run. It would be John Adams. It's also he wanted out. He wasn't necessarily, wanted the office of President of the United States. He felt more responsible to take on the position, and sort of sacrifice some good years of his life to be in a place that he didn't necessarily want to be. The early government up in New York and Philadelphia, they moved around, not where he really wanted to be, down in his plantation, Mount Vernon in Virginia. And so after 8 years, he's like, I'm out. And but he set that precedent. From this point on, no president would serve more than 2 terms until much later, on the eve of World War II, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt made the decision to stay on for a 3rd and then a 4th term. He died early in his 4th term, right near the end of World War II. At that point, the amended the Constitution, you can only do 2 terms. So all the ones before FDR, they were just doing it out of the example set by Washington. Now, some other things he also established, and we'll look at, they come a little bit later, the role of government to regulate commerce and to exercise taxes and banks and these things. We'll look at that in the next lecture. And his foreign affairs. He's going to take on a policy of neutrality that will be a guiding force in American foreign policy for centuries to come. That's not really finally broken as a policy until after World War II and the onset of the Cold War. So a very long guiding foreign policy of neutrality in world affairs. And setting a good relationship with Britain as well. He understood that Britain was their, even though they've broken away independently from them, they still have a relationship with them. They still have feelings towards Britain. They have a commonality with them, and trade, lots of trade with them. So he wants to build up and reestablish that relationship with Britain. And setting the idea of a farewell address, a bye-bye address. He's been with the American public since 1754 as a young man out in the wilderness and setting off the French and Indian War, and then has been them all through this process of declaring independence, winning the war for independence, setting up a new constitution, being the first president for 8 years, and now he's going to step aside. He's going to disappear from public life and settle back in as a private citizen. So he said bye, and in his farewell address, he gave some advice, some warnings, some other things. We'll be looking at that, of course, a very important document in American history. But that set a precedent that future presidents would also said of, it's time to go. Here's what I have to say on my way out. All right, so next lecture we'll look at the economic and domestic policy of the early United States, and then into the foreign policy. So let's just finish by looking at the cabinet. There's Washington and, the idea of dignity. He had the same horse, I forget the horse's name, but he had the same horse, a white horse that he loved dearly. And, coming in on a white horse, and made sure that there's lots of sort of that imagery of the gallant, strong leader. And his cabinet, and small compared to today's cabinets. He had 4. Top left is Thomas Jefferson, great mind. He was Secretary of State, meaning the foreign affairs. And he's a very experienced diplomat, especially in France. On the right side, Alexander Hamilton, almost like an adopted son to George Washington. And he's in charge of the money. These two, Jefferson and Hamilton, are going to be, we can see the ghosts of these two in American politics today, the division that was set between these two. And maybe it's sort of on purpose that Washington wanted these two separate minds. And then often forgotten, Henry Knox, War and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. But it's the two guys at the top, Jefferson and Hamilton. That's going to be setting the stage for political divisions and the first sort of party system, political party system. We'll get into that in our next lecture. Thank you very much for listening.